So, it seems your video on that horny wrestling game did really well.
Yeah, I know. I'm just as shocked as you are.
So, what you gonna do now?
Well, that's obvious. I gotta play the sequel and talk about it.
Is there enough to talk about?
See, now that is the best part. There's a lot to talk about.
Something to live for. It's something to die for. Something to live for. It's something to die for. Take me first. Take me first. So that she won't get hurt. Won't get hurt. If it's something to live for, it's something to die for. At least that's the way that I look at it. If you can't live without it, then know that about it. You would jump right in front of bullets. You say, take me first, take me first. This or that shade won't get hurt, won't get hurt.
Greetings, my naughty little mosh pit. Welcome to the Virtual Sanctuary. I am Wing Wolf, the girly wolf pup, and Rumble Roses XX. It was a game that came out in 2006 that I originally thought dropped in 2013, but no, it was 2006. Now, when I originally bought the game in order to play it, I wasn't expecting too much different from the OG. However, upon spending several days playing the game, I can safely say that there is quite a lot added to this game compared to the first one. However, before I discuss the game itself, I want to share a story about how fucking complicated it was to get my hands on this game in 2024. For starters, my original plan was to get the game digital, but that fell through for two reasons. One is that the 360 can't read modern Wi-Fi router signals, and even if I could, my second obstacle showed up. The Xbox Live shutdown of July 2024, basically resulting in me having to get a physical copy, because 360 emulation isn't as easy to get into as the PS2 emulation was. I only bring up this process to make it very clear to you all why it's so irritating that a lot of 360 PS3 era games aren't on modern platforms like Steam, because due to that lack of a modern port, trying to get my, and by extent possibly your, hands on these games is more difficult than it should be. This game's physical copy literally cost me $62 on eBay, as it's far more expensive when compared to its predecessor. So just know that my enjoyment of this franchise has now become an investment. However, once I did get my hands on the game, I played it for several weeks, trying my best to engage with the game's various modes. Originally, my plan was to finish the story mode like I did with the first game, but I didn't accomplish that for reasons I'll tackle later. So instead, I decided it'd be best to explore the game's various modes, its additions, one massive removal, and the overall creation behind XX, in an effort to try and explain why, while Rumble Roses XX is a solid game in its own right, it ended up lacking when compared to the previous game. Actually, funny enough, this is the perfect segue to discuss Akara Yuchida's own thoughts on XX, and its development when compared to the first game. There's this one interview he did with GameSpy in regards to XX and the ratings board of Japan becoming stricter for the time, which, most interestingly, to me, led into him discussing his dissatisfaction with how the first game was marketed in America.
The first game was really sexy and provocative, and it seems like this one is going even further down that road. I was wondering if you ran into any problems or if you were worried about anything.
I'm very much aware that rating boards have become stricter and all of that, but at the same time, there's no sex in the game. There's no... Is the word in the game? And the game is not violent. It's a wrestling game, but at the same time, there's no violence. You know what I mean. I think it's a very peaceful game in that sense. Actually, the real concern I have is that I think this game was promoted in a very cheesy, silly, catfight way, and that's not what the game is about. It's a solid fighting game, too. That's a mistake we do not want to make this time. I guess when the first game came out, it was really one of the first games to feature sexy girls like this, so there was really no precedent. People had to perceive it the way that they were used to, as a really catfighty game. Now that this game is coming out in the next generation consoles, people can really look at it and see that there's a lot of effort and money going into it, and see that it's not some cheesy game.
This interview quote only really served to further validate my analysis of the first game, as it's clear Uchida himself didn't like the idea of Rumble Roses being seen exclusively as some softcore porn game. There's a clear desire to make a legitimate wrestling game with Rumble Roses, and he wasn't happy with the fact that people undervalued its attempts at such entirely because it featured sexy girls. And we could talk about how general audiences tend to take media featuring open sexuality less seriously, regardless of their actual content or intent, but I feel like I expressed enough of that in the video on the first game, so I'll just shorten this point by saying that Uchida actively wanted to avoid this misrepresentation of Rumble Roses with its sequel. Another fascinating fact about XX is its jump to Xbox 360 when the first game was exclusive to the PlayStation 2. A lot of people these days would probably be confused by this choice, but it's easy to speculate if you think about it during the time period. The Xbox 360 released in 2005, while the PS3 released in 2006, the same year as Rumble Roses XX, so it's likely Yuke's chose the 360 as their next-gen platform of choice because the PS3 was still in development. However, this choice probably helped them in the long run, as most PS2 owners jumped to the 360 anyway, as it launched at a far better price point than the PS3 did. It also had Dead Rising, which is one of the most polished and put together games in the mid-2000s. That's unrelated, I just wanted to say that out loud so people in the audience know my stance on that. But back to the topic at hand, what does Rumble Roses XX add? What makes it worth discussing beyond just being the sequel to Rumble Roses? Well, I think it's time to properly get into the meat of the video game. So Rumble Roses XX at its core is very similar to the first game mechanically. However, there are some additions that I'd consider different from its predecessor. For starters, there's a direction input aspect now, where the direction the player holds when they press the attack button results in different moves being done, which does make sense as Uchida did want to emphasize Rumble Roses XX's position as a legit fighting game. He even made parallels to Tekken in that earlier mentioned GameSpy interview, and while he used that quote as a way to advertise the new Street Fight mode, I'd argue it applies to the main game as well because of stuff like the addition of analog inputs. Like, yeah, it's not as complex as the inputs of something like Tekken, but compared to the first game's more simple but engaging style of gameplay, it is an addition worth pointing out due to it adding complexity to XX that wasn't in the original Rumble Roses. Another thing that this sequel adds are more game modes. Quite a number of them, actually. First off, a very simple addition is the Tag Team Match mode, which despite being incredibly common in other wrestling video games, was absent from the first Rumble Roses, and is making its series debut here in XX. The idea is simple. You pick two characters and fight two other characters, being able to tag in between the two during the match. Your teammate is also able to assist you if you get pinned, but this is RNG based as far as I can tell, and you're even able to knock the partner off the sidelines if you hit them, which is a neat detail. Street Fight mode is another addition. This mode is a more traditional fighting game mode with a proper health bar and is likely where the Tekken adjacent inspirations went into for this game. It's a mode I barely played, but it's fine for what it is. The last major addition mode-wise is the Queen's Match, which is basically just a regular wrestling match, but it takes place in the beach arena, and the loser has to be humiliated in whatever way you choose as the punishment. This mode clearly replaces the mud wrestling mode as the game mode where all the TNA happens the most, so you can be like Dr. Wily in Mega Man 6 and play this mode whenever you're spending some quality time in your goon cave.
A bit edgier and shit.
Fucking
Because in the original game when,
no, fucking Rock enters the stage, it's like, oh my god, why are there cunt lines? There cum on the walls! And then Wily just shows up, he's like, the Mega Man, welcome to my goon cave! This is where I jack off to thick femboy ass!
XX also felt the need to add a character creator, but before you get excited, it sucks. The character creator in this game is incredibly limited, and you're not really going to be able to make anything of value with it. Perhaps I'm just spoiled by the likes of Sunset Overdrive and Code Vein, which you could easily say I'm being unfair by mentioning those two games, as they're more modern, while Rumble Roses XX is a game from 2006. However, Saints Row 2 came out in 2008, which was only 2 years after this game, and had a far more in-depth character creator for the time, so I don't really think my disappointment is entirely due to being spoiled by modern games and their in-depth character creators. I feel like I'm harping on it, but I was looking forward to the fact XX had a character creator. Wrestling games tend to have pretty in-depth character creators, and it's just kinda lame that XX isn't all that interesting. According to Bumble McFumbles, Yuke's 2023 release AEW Fight Forever's character creator is also pretty bare bones, so maybe character creators just aren't Yuke's strong suit. Now, you might think with all these cool sounding concepts added to XX that it would have to be better than the first game, right? Well, no, actually. Which leads me to finally discussing the massive removal I alluded to earlier. Rumble Roses XX doesn't have a story mode like the first game had, and in my opinion, This is actually the biggest flaw with XX as a whole, and on a greater scale, it actually plays a big role into why I feel like XX is admittedly worse than the first game. If you watched my video on the first Rumble Roses, you know one of the main things that attracted me to it in the first place was the fact that its storylines felt exactly like the ones in the real-life pro wrestling. The stories of each character in the first game really did help in elevating said characters for me. Maybe this will be seen as dumb to an outsider because admittedly, the stories in the first Rumble Roses aren't deep or anything, but the camp of the Rumble Roses story mode is the main reason as to why I became so enchanted with Rumble Roses in the first place. XX not having that story mode causes XX to feel hollow. While it does bother me that people who've never played the games think they're just Gooner games, if XX was someone's only exposure to the series, then that first impression would unfortunately have some understandable basis, because XX comes off shallow in comparison to the first game. I think in a weird way, Rumble Roses XX is the perfect argument for why stories are an important part of making an amazing game, because the first game was only able to be great in my eyes because of its story on top of the stellar gameplay. Meanwhile with XX, sure the gameplay is still solid, but without that story it feels subpar, and constantly throughout my time playing it, I really just wanted to play the first game again instead. Sure, Rumble Roses doesn't have tag team, or customization, or queens matches, or any of that stuff, but sometimes less is more. Sometimes all a game needs is solid gameplay, a good story, and a charming set of characters to be great. It's wild to me how gamers nowadays are obsessed with long run times and all of that shit. Meanwhile, I've sunk almost 200 hours into a game that's average runtime is 11 hours. You can slap as many new features and HD textures onto your sequel, but it'll mean nothing overall if the experience as a whole feels hollow, which unfortunately, XX feels just that. Hollow. I'd love for this to be where I end the video on a cliffhanger alluding to a future video on the third game, but this is where the hard part comes in. There is no sequel beyond this point. Rumble Roses as a franchise died here. And outside of a cameo from Reiko and Super Bomberman R, the series has basically gone unused by Konami since 2006. Rumble Roses will likely remain dormant. There's no real massive demand for such a niche series to return, and Ukes are off doing other things these days. Don't get me wrong, this isn't the end of me making content on the channel based around this series, but it's very bittersweet to know that I'm never going to get to play these games for the first time again. Hurts a bit more knowing the series ended on such a lackluster sequel too. I made that original Rumble Roses video because I wanted to give the game the kind of deeper look that it seemed like nobody else was willing to. As a result, several comments expressed their joy in seeing me discuss the game in a more dignified manner compared to others on the platform. Other comments discussed how my video piqued their interest in the series as a whole, and that made me realize that maybe it's better when a series is dormant sometimes. Too often, people will beg for niche IPs like Sly Cooper or Star Fox to come back, and while returns would be cool, I also see value in letting series end and for people to experience them as they were, knowing that these games were creations made by people who wanted to make something and to put it out for an audience. Nostalgic throwbacks and grand returns are dope as hell, and sometimes can lead to great installments in a once dormant franchise, but other times, it results in diminished returns and a sullying of the original series. Unfortunately, Rumble Roses is going to have to sit alongside Bayonetta, No More Heroes, and Dead Rising, as a franchise where the first game is the best one and its sequels, even if good, were unable to recapture the same level of focus and overall quality that the first game had in my opinion. Perhaps most won't see this as big of an issue with XX that I did, but I also went into it with such a high expectation considering everything the first game did right in my eyes. Regardless of how I felt about this sequel, I'm glad I spent this summer getting into Rumble Roses as a franchise overall. It's always a joy to stumble across a forgotten gem of the past like Rumble Roses. The kind of games that existed in their eras of gaming where you look at them and just know they came from the decade they were released in. And while our time with these games may be short, it's important to cherish what we were given and recognize what they mean to us, the audience. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to video games, power is within the players. I've been the Girly Wolf Pup, and until the bell rings again, until we enter the ring once more, and until the roses are ready to rumble, I'll be seeing you.